Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Owen Riel, and this is the Collective Record. You got it? Cut the video. And welcome back to episode number 5. It's our 5th episode. I'm feeling great, as always. I am Owen Riel. This is Emma Kaser. And we're so excited to be back for another episode. So, as I traditionally like to do, we're going to start with our spicy news segment because it's cayenne pepper. Yeah. I'm sure that's not. I'm sure that's not getting old yet. Okay, so there's very important stuff internationally going on today with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi being killed. The leader of ISIS was killed today in northwestern Syria. But Emma's going to talk about that more in like 2 minutes. So we're going to talk about our other spicy news. So as well, there was a climate march in Vancouver on the 25th of October, led by Greta Thunberg, which, you know, we love Greta. She's super cool and
Very
hip
cool. Yeah.
and Swedish. Yeah. Thumbs up. Sure. And our last topic is Wexeter. If everyone knows what that is, Wexeter is western exit of Canada. Just kind of ripping off the phrase Brexit. But yeah, there's been some talks. It's not exceptionally popular in the West, but about 1 in 6 people in Alberta are in favor of leaving Canada. And that has been something that has been addressed by several conservative politicians, especially with the Trudeau government having no mandate in Alberta at all. There are no Liberal seats in Alberta and no Liberal seats in Saskatchewan. It's a block of blue. So yeah, we're going to talk about that as well after we do our international segment. But yeah, I think we're going to jump right into Emma's segment on Syria and the Syrian civil war.
Okay, so as you guys have probably seen in the news recently, there's been recent developments in Syria. So I want to talk about that. But I also would like to go into a little bit more of the historical context here, what has happened so far in the war, the main causes, all that, so that we can truly understand what's happening in Syria right now. So let's go to the main causes. So the Syrian civil war started not randomly, but actually in the context of the Arab Spring. And it was based upon kind of a regional religious struggle. So in Syria, there's the majority Sunni Muslims and the minority Alawi sect. So the small government, which it's a dictatorship, right? So it's not a democracy, and it's a very small government, and it's comprised mainly of the Alawi people, which is the minority. So this minority, that includes the president, Bashar al-Assad. So this is viewed as kind of, to be an equal, right? The majority is a different ethnicity. The government is only this one minority, and it caused a lot of tension. So we have that one kind of religious struggle, and then we also have that it was a very authoritarian regime, right? So there was a definitive lack of human rights, of civil rights, of political rights, and there was a lot of poverty, a lot of social unrest, and people were just very unhappy with their government and with their lack of rights, their lack of ability to participate in a political process. And then another factor was that global warming actually played a role. So from 2007 to 2010, there was a lot of flooding in Syria, and 1.5 million people were already displaced at that point. So once again, this is contributing to that kind of social unrest, right? So let's talk about the trigger event. So in March of 2011, there were these 15 schoolboys, and they were inspired by the events of the Arab Spring that was happening in countries all around them. And they wrote graffiti in support of this, movement for democracy on a wall, I think, of their school. And the government responded by detaining and horrifically torturing these children, right? One of them was killed in the process. So there was all this outrage about that, right? That they were just, 15 kids who were inspired by actions around them and decided to put graffiti on a wall. So there were protests everywhere, but they were actually mainly peaceful. And I know at the time a lot of people thought that this might be Syria's kind of Arab Spring, right? That they might move to a democracy. But then Bashar al-Assad began this like just rampant campaign of killing and imprisoning demonstrators, and it triggered a panicked response by the population, right? So then this led to then rebel groups being formed, or gay rebel groups that were already existent being stronger, and this whole Syrian civil war broke out. So let's go over the key actors one more time. So we have the Bashar al-Assad government, right? So the Syria's government before this kind of rebel movement, and they're backed by Russia and China and Iraq and Iran. And then we have the Free Syrian Army, which is a part of the Syrian military that defected and, kind of formed this rebel group. And they're backed by Turkey and Saudi Arabia because Turkey and Saudi Arabia are Sunni majority countries. And this group was also backed by the US for a period of time. Then we have the SDF, which is a kind of Kurdish rebel group, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that now. We'll talk more about it later. And then we have terrorist organizations such as ISIS, which Owen was talking about earlier, and Al-Qaeda. Okay. So let's go, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let's go a little bit into the humanitarian consequences, right? This civil war in Syria has caused the whole refugee crisis across Europe, right? Which in turn has caused things like Brexit. So I want to talk a little bit about the suffering of the Syrian people because it's really terrible. So human rights have really just been disregarded by all parties in the Syrian conflict, not only, the government or rebel groups, it's just been everyone, and this includes, very sadly, the use of chemical weapons, which is a violation of international law. Which is interesting because it's not only the Syrian government or, rebel groups or terrorist organizations that are using these, but it is everyone. It's Russia who is in there backing Syria. It's really a mess, and multiple times there've been agreements where these groups have agreed, we're not going to target hospitals, we're not going to, and everything has been ignored, right? So there's really all kind of, rules of war have just been thrown out the window. And as a result, unfortunately, over 750,000 people have been murdered. Over 5.6 million people have taken refuge outside of Syria's borders, and 6.6 million people were displaced internally. And I'm sure those numbers are rising right now, but those are the latest statistics. So, like I said, there's just very dire conditions. 11.7 million people are in need of humanitarian aid and assistance. And one of the really, I think, kind of more horrific points here is that they are not receiving this aid because Bashar al-Assad's government is politicizing this aid. So usually when you're like an NGO, like Save the Children or the Red Cross, right? You go into a country, you help people there, you're impartial, right? You help everyone who is injured or who needs, food or whatever. You don't take sides. But what Bashar al-Assad is doing is that he is making humanitarian agencies and NGOs register in Damascus, which he controls, right? So that means he basically controls what kind of aid is being received, and he is controlling who is receiving it, which means it is only his military, civilians in his territory that are receiving this military aid, which means a huge part of Syria's population is just left out completely and is suffering. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit into UN action. Just very briefly, everyone has been speaking out against the Syrian civil war, but no actual resolutions have been made by the Security Council, simply for the reason that Russia and China have veto power in the Security Council. And like I was saying before, Russia and China back the Syrian government, right? Bashar al-Assad's government. So they've blocked and vetoed any bills concerning, real action to be taken in Syria. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the causes, the history. Let's go into what's going on right now. So this month, and this is probably what you've been seeing on the news, right? This month, Trump declared ISIS defeated and decided to pull US troops out of Syria. So let's go into the background. Why was the US in Syria in the first place? So in 2015, ISIS controlled territories across Syria and Iraq that were home to about 10 million people. So they were very prominent at the time. They controlled a lot of territory. And the Obama administration decided to get involved and send troops to help push back ISIS. This was in October 2015. So the US troops weren't actually meant to engage in direct military conflict. They were there to advise and assist the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, right? We were talking about it earlier, the Kurdish kind of rebel fighter groups. Mm-hmm. And they were not supposed to engage in direct combat unless for self-defense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the SDF. Once again, they are this Kurdish rebel fighter group, and they are really the main force of opposition against ISIS. So they are the group that has been mainly fighting ISIS. They took back major Syrian cities and territories and pushed ISIS into a small corner in eastern Syria, which means that ISIS at that point, and at this point effectively, controls less than 1% of the territory they once had. So the US was allied with this group, which is why Trump is saying, right, the US has defeated ISIS. We can now pull our troops out of Syria, which is what they were originally there for. Which, you know, if you phrase it that way, that might make sense, but there's actually a lot of issues with this decision. So let's talk about those issues. So the first one, of course, is ISIS, right? Yes, they have been pushed back dramatically. It's fair to say that they are almost defeated. But they are not completely defeated. They're estimated to have about 2,000 fighters left. And at this point, you know, obviously, as we were saying today, this has changed. But at this point, ISIS leadership was still intact. So that means the SDF was still fighting ISIS, mainly for one major hold, which is a city called Hijin. I might be pronouncing that wrong, sorry about that. But, so this is an issue, right? They are still fighting ISIS. Yes, they are mainly defeated, but it has not been accomplished yet. Or at least at that point, right? We'll go more into more recent developments.
And part of the reason why a terrorist group like ISIS is so hard to completely wipe out, like, just to get an idea, ISIS controlled all the way from Baghdad in Iraq, which is, if you look at a map of Iraq, almost halfway through the country, and almost all the way to Aleppo in Syria, which is a massive span of land. Like, it was the shape of a relatively large country in the Middle East. And even though it's so tiny now and it's in one holdout left, 2,000 ISIS fighters can do a lot of damage because they don't fight wars like a traditional military fights wars, right? They use car bombs, they use suicide bombs, they shoot people, they shoot civilians to terrify them. It's not as if the United States, and well, the United States is pulled out now, but it's not as if the SDF is fighting another military. Mm-hmm. They're fighting an organization that has that, and the terrorist organization in some cases has an upper hand because of the way they fight.
And there's also historical concern here because under the Obama administration, when that administration had troops in Iraq, when they pulled them out, this created kind of a vacuum, which ISIS ended up filling, right? That was when ISIS really started, you know, taking off. Mm-hmm. And Trump at the time was actually very critical of this. So I think it's curious to see that he's making the exact same, you know, maybe mistake that Obama made. So yeah, there's that worry of ISIS not being completely defeated and ISIS just flaring up again dramatically, right? Both in Syria and Iraq and in terrorist attacks overseas.
It's fun to see all the... it's fun to look at Trump's tweets. I mean, I know you can't measure policy by Trump tweets, but it's funny to see all the flips that he's made over the course of the last 3 years.
He's very unpredictable. He has no clear position.
It's not... He's just stupid, basically. Okay. I mean, he just lacks intelligence.
That is a fair point. Okay, so then the second point is that because the Civil War, you know, once again, at this point was settling down a little bit. So there's the concern that it's once again going to flare up dramatically, or there was this concern, you know, once again, more recent developments we'll talk about. So with Russian and Iranian support, Bashar al-Assad's regime had taken back much of control from, you know, rebel groups. The real stronghold that Bashar al-Assad didn't have was territory controlled by the SDF, right? So that Kurdish force. So there is that worried that if the US pulls out, they are just going to flare up the civil war again, right? The US has been concentrated on fighting ISIS and kind of thereby creating an autonomous area not under Bashar al-Assad's rule. Yeah, sorry about that. So there's a concern that obviously there's going to be more violence, right? And then let's look at what's been going on recently, which was a worry at the time and did end up happening. The worry was that Turkey would attack the Kurdish US allies, right? So the SDF, Kurdish rebel groups, and if the US was kind of like stationed as a buffer between them, right? They kind of served as like a peace force. Not officially, but they have been that buffer.
Well, and there was reason. Sorry to interrupt. There was reason to worry about the Kurds' safety in the hands of Turkey, because Turkey has historically oppressed Kurdish people, like, for a very long time, and still do.
If you scroll down, you could
politically.
see a whole
were you about to? Why does Turkey
this.
want to? Yeah. But yeah, they've even recently any Kurds who are politically active have been censored and sometimes sent to jail.
So, what is being criticized here is that the US is just abandoning their allies, right? They have been fighting alongside the Kurdish SDF, to defeat ISIS, and they're suddenly abandoning them to deal with, the remains of ISIS on their own, to deal with Turkey, who is going to likely attack them on their own, right? So, but there's different factors we have to consider, because the US was allied with these Kurdish groups, but Turkey is also a US NATO ally, so there's kind of pressure coming from all sides. So, yes, there was this worry, this kind of concern, and there was a lot of critique over it. So I found this tweet by Donald Trump that I want to read to you, just because it's hilarious.
My favorite activity.
Oh yeah, right, because he was being criticized. So, of course, he decided to respond by going on Twitter. I'm going to read this to you, okay? Here, Donald Trump. As I have stated strongly before, and just to reiterate, if Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy.
Totally destroy. Annihilate.
Obliterate the economy of Turkey.
Obliterate.
I've done it before! Exclamation mark.
Completely destroy. Obliterate. Annihilate. I use synonyms.
Is just ridiculous. Like, I'm gonna totally destroy and obliterate the economy. I'm like, no, you can't.
I'm going to totally destroy it. It's going to be gone.
In his great and unmatched wisdom.
I will bring their economy to zero.
Yeah. It's just too easy to make fun of him. I just thought I had to share that beautiful tweet with everyone here on the collective record. But yeah, so indeed, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, right, announced a military operation against the Kurds.
My best friend. Sorry, I'll stop.
Okay. All right. We'll get you a wing. You can be Trump. So there's a concern this military operation against the Kurds, will turn into some kind of ethnic cleansing. And then, of course, also, the Kurds are still fighting against ISIS, right? So that means they'll be fighting against ISIS, and they'll be forced to fight against Turkey, which means they will be weak on both sides because they're fighting against two different groups. So, once again, ISIS might flare up again. This is, a huge concern. And then, of course, that, the humanitarian crisis is going to flare up again. It's going to increase. And there's just kind of going to be this mass murder, which is horrific, obviously. Yeah. Okay, so Owen already stole my next point because he did not bother to read my notes before the segment.
I skimmed through.
So we're going to go a little bit more into why does Turkey want to attack the Kurdish people? Because this seems a little random and really, unfounded. So the Kurdish people are kind of, they have, as Owen said, historically been oppressed and marginalized in the Middle East. So despite this, they are, however, actually the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East, the fourth largest ethnic group.
Yeah. And
they still are being oppressed. So their traditional homeland would stretch across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Armenia. But after World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, a lot of Kurdish people, they were living across this region, and they wanted an independent Kurdish state. So promises were actually made, and early treaties, when these countries were being developed, for the creation of Kurdistan, which would have been that Kurdish independent state. But when the region was eventually, divided up, it never happened. So that means they were kind of, a stateless people, I think you would say, right? Yeah, they were kind of stateless people. And they have since then made numerous attempts at nationhood, which have not worked out. And, Turkey has been very central to this conflict because there were a lot of Kurdish people living in Turkey, right? So there was this domestic conflict in the early 1980s. There was a domestic conflict in Turkey. So there was the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which, like a Kurdish worker party, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of had this violent separatist movement in the country. So they were considered a terrorist group by Turkey's government. They were defeated, but they were kind of also pushed across the border. And, they eventually developed into the YPG, which is a group that wants an autonomous state for the Kurds. Once again, right, they want their own state. And then this kind of developed with, other regional groups in Syria into the SDF, right? Like we've been talking about Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish groups that largely defeated ISIS. So I just want to make it clear that, the SDF is, despite what Turkey may claim, not a terrorist group. They are fighting against a terrorist group, namely ISIS. Turkey considers them a terrorist group because, like Owen says, they are violently racist against Kurdish people.
Yeah.
Right? Because of this Kurdish Workers' Party history, they developed this bias and this racism.
Your laptop is banging on the table.
I know. I'll put it on my lap. It's fine.
Sorry.
I'm getting wound up.
Sorry to call you out on. Call you out like that.
If I had a better table.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. That's enough of that.
Yeah. You see his desk?
It's my desk.
Okay. Let's continue.
Okay. So let's see. We've gone into the history. Where are we now? So on October 9th, Turkey started, predictably once again, an offensive against the SDF, the Kurdish fighters. So Turkey had for a long kind of had this claim of, they wanted to create a safe zone against the Turkish border, so that Syrian refugees could return. So, they say this is so refugees can return. This means they would be pushing out SDF groups. It's really just, like I said, fueled by ethnic hate. And so they started this military offensive, of course, which once again is probably and has had disastrous consequences. And, various European nations immediately halted arms sales in Turkey, spoke out against Turkey. The Arab League called for UN action. And I think I was reading this early and I was like, oh my god, even Putin spoke out against Turkey attacking the SDF in Syria. Like, Putin, right? You know how truly bad your, military action policy is if Putin says it's a bad idea, right? Like, I was shocked to see that, actually. I was really surprised. So I just think that really speaks to truly how bad of a decision this is of Turkey, and really how unfounded it is to, it's really only about that kind of racism they have.
Yeah. Yeah,
okay, so Turkey seized control of one of the two major cities under the SDF and 14 other villages. And, in an official statement, they declared them, liberated and free from this terrorist organization. So once again, that kind of propaganda brought out to the Turkish people, right? Furthering that racism. And then, so that happened, and then there was another occurrence, kind of, that happened at the same time. So, in Qamishli, which was one of the major Kurdish towns, a car bomb explosion killed 3 people. A couple of days later, ISIS claimed responsibility for this, and a couple of hours after this event occurred, 5 ISIS fighters broke out of a nearby prison. So we can already see ISIS is beginning to flare up again, right? For taking renewed action, which is exactly what everyone was afraid of would happen. So following this military operation by the Turkey government, who, by the way, keeps putting out statements like, 325 terrorists killed, which is SDF fighters, right? Those are not terrorists. It's disgusting. But, following this operation, the UN estimates that over 100,000 civilians have been displaced, in addition to, of course, everyone else who is already displaced, right? So it just keeps getting worse. So Trump, in his, what was it? In his great and unmatched wisdom.
Annihilation.
Okay.
Destroy their economy. Zero. Okay. Down to zero.
He did take action, though, to his credit. He did do something. So he halted negotiations on a $100 billion trade deal with Turkey. He raised steel tariffs back up to 50%. And he imposed sanctions on 3 senior Turkish officials and Turkey's defense and energy ministers. So he did take action in his great and unmatched wisdom. I cannot get over that phrase. I mean, no smart person says, this is the
I am a very stable genius. A very stable genius.
Oh, yeah. Me too. Me too, Trump.
Several times.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so Donald Trump's actions have just been very contradictory, right? So this whole kind of recent thing started because he said he was going to pull troops out of Syria. Then Turkey threatened to, attack. He imposed sanctions. Turkey did attack. He like I said, he imposed sanctions. But then Trump, before this already, contradicted his earlier decision of pulling troops out of Syria by saying that he wanted to keep troops there to protect oil fields and potentially actually deploy more troops. Right? So he is all over the place here. His great and unmatched wisdom is not focused on one area.
Well, he's following a pattern of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and just doing it poorly. He's just doing it in a less organized way.
This is a really interesting decision for various reasons, right? So there's oil fields in Syria, right? Some of these were Kurdish controlled. These are ones Donald Trump is talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's worried about now that, Turkey has stacked Kurdish groups, that these oil fields are going to fall to ISIS. So what he's now decided to do is put troops there to protect said oil fields. Well, I mean, what's that going to look like, right? If ISIS attacks the oil fields, right, what's going to happen? And if you look at a map of this, it's a very geographically vulnerable location. They would just, basically, U.S. troops would be lying on Syria, and so Syria's government, right, Bashar al-Assad, those troops and Russian troops to kind of support them protecting these oil fields, and it makes no sense to me. And I think that it's also interesting that it's almost like he's staking, claim to this oil, right? Which he can't really do as a foreign power in another country. He was there to, troops were there to fight against ISIS. Now we're claiming oil fields. That seems very...
But that's been done. It's not like that's never been done before.
But it should not
be done. It shouldn't be done.
I mean, I think that's incredibly controversial, right? That he feels that he has the right to...
But
because technically these oil fields would belong to Syria's government, Bashar al-Assad. So I
mean,
I can't really...
Not that I necessarily think that Bashar al-Assad deserves...
No,
much of anything.
For his state sovereignty...
Yes.
And,
And at this point, you can't violate state sovereignty. But that's a very...
as a government, personally,
United States...
I support the Syrian Democratic Forces, but...
That's a very United States kind of action, right? Laying claim to an oil field that really... I mean, it's one thing,
Well, not necessarily outright laying claim, but saying... We're going to send troops to protect an oil field. What does that mean, right? That's just...
Yeah, I mean...
That's vague, and it sounds like he's taking claim to oil fields in the Middle East, which is unacceptable.
The bottom line is that he shouldn't have stopped protecting the Kurds in the first place, The Kurds are a marginalized group and need to be protected not only from ISIS, but from a NATO ally, right?
The Kurds don't need to be protected from ISIS. The Kurds were fighting ISIS.
Yeah.
Right?
But at this point,
he abandoned his Kurdish allies.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's saying he wants to protect oil fields instead of, I mean, it's just...
No, it doesn't make sense. But it's, Trump foreign policy.
Yeah, well...
What can I say?
It's upsetting to me.
Yes.
I think it does not make a lot of sense. But yeah, so Turkey, right, where we were at, Turkey was attacking the Kurdish people. And, there was a lot of pressure on Turkey, like I was already saying, and they agreed to a 5-day ceasefire to allow the SDF to withdraw. So during the ceasefire, Turkey and Russia struck a deal, and under this agreement, Russia and Syria will, facilitate the removal from the border regions of the SDF, whatever that means, but it means in a peaceful way. That is clear. Not sure how the specifics will look. I think it just means that they're supposed to leave, and Russia and Syria will enforce this, right? And basically, they are allowing Turkey to create this safe zone that they want to create. But it is going to be less than half the size, I'm pretty sure, of what Turkey wanted it to be originally. But they did agree to that. This safe zone has been created. So a peace agreement was reached.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see how long it lasts. But an agreement was brokered. Okay. And then, finally, we're going to talk about, after that whole history and background, we're going to talk about what happened today, or yesterday, which was that Trump confirmed the death of ISIS leader al-Baghdadi in a military operation in Syria's northwest Idlib province. So apparently al-Baghdadi exploded himself and 3 of his children with like a suicide bombing vest he was wearing, right? So there was a military operation going on, and he decided to kill himself, I guess.
Well, that wasn't before he ran away from U.S. troops for quite some time and escaped into a tunnel with his 3 children.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this kind of, right, so the U.S. had a military operation in Syria, and it was after they received intelligence on this leader's location. So this is obviously a huge victory. So as much as I hate to give Trump credit and his great and unmatched wisdom, I guess I'm going to have to, right? The leader of ISIS is dead. This is a huge victory. He was widely considered the most wanted man for a while. He had 25 billion US dollars on his head. So it is a huge victory. There are still, members of ISIS present, but with their leader killed, they've taken a serious hit. So I think this is a victory.
And it was funny, other than the fact that he had his children with him. He ran away. He
3
ran
of his children. Yeah. He has 11 kids left.
It was interesting to see the way, rather than facing up to his death, because he knew the U.S. was going to get him when they were chasing him. But rather than facing his death, he ran away like a coward, because he's a coward, and that's what a lot of these, terrorist leaders are. Is they're cowardly people, and I think it was it was interesting to hear that. I mean, we knew that he was a terrible person, but how afraid he was too. Expecting other people. He's brainwashed people into dying for his cause, and then he tried to run from U.S. troops.
Absolutely, yeah. So I do have to give Trump credit for that. These are really good news. So we'll see how this further develops, and hope that Turkey will maintain peace and not attack SDF forces. But something will have to give, because Bashar al-Assad is obviously still trying to take all of Syria back. So there's definitely going to, unfortunately, be more conflict coming up in that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's about it.
So that's all for this segment, the segment on the Syrian civil war. We're going to take a little 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the results of the election and some personal thoughts I have about what we can do as young people. That in 10 minutes. And we are back from our 10-minute break. Okay, so we have a very exciting segment about the election results. The election kind of played out how we thought it was going to. I think the seats played out how we thought they were going to. The Liberals got the most seats. They got 57 seats, and the NDP got 27, which together does make a majority. But rather than the Liberals opting into holding a coalition, they've instead decided that they want to have a minority government, which means that on each bill they pass, they have to get at least one other party with more than 13 seats. So that's the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, and the Conservatives to sign off on it. Which I think was an interesting choice. I think the Liberals did that because they don't want to be beholden to progressivism. They don't want to be as progressive as they act in campaigns, I think, really, is what it boils down to. I don't think they want to keep the promises that they make that are left-leaning. I think they don't want to have the NDP breathing down their necks every time they do something that's centrist. And they don't campaign centrist, they just govern as centrists. And I think from that standpoint, what they did was strategically well done, but it's not good for progressives or for the left in general. And the Liberals lost about 25 seats, which is quite a few. And the Conservatives currently make up the largest opposition party in Canadian history, with about 120 seats. And it's interesting that they've come so close, but the Liberals are still able to stay ahead, even with a strong Bloc Québécois and an NDP that's still holding a lot of their support. But one of the things that I thought was interesting was the Conservatives lost one of their cabinet ministers in Lisa Raitt in Milton, Ontario. And they lost it by a couple thousand votes. And she was a very powerful, she was the deputy leader of the Conservatives while they were the opposition for a while, before Andrew Scheer was even part of the equation. So to lose her is a big deal for the party. The NDP actually took quite a few losses as well. They lost 18 seats in this election, but the Greens, they won a seat. They got 3 now instead of 2. We were hoping for more gains from the Greens, if we're being honest, right? I think we kind of wish they would have hit the 6 that they were competitive in. But any gains for the Green Party is a good thing, as far as we're concerned. One positive point of the election is that Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party, lost his seat. He got voted out.
We're very happy about it.
We're so happy. I was so happy to see him go. Oh boy, I was cheering, and I cried a little tear of joy, if I'm being honest, when I saw that news. I was so happy. I'm done with him. I'm sick of him. He's bigot and he's gross, and we don't have to think about him anymore because he's not in the House of Commons and his party is going to get destroyed. So good stuff. One funny thing I noticed was the Liberals throughout the election played this game of like, oh, you better vote Liberal or you're going to get a Conservative. And that was generally not true. In quite a few ridings, where either the Liberals won or even the Greens and the NDP won, the Conservatives weren't in second place. The Conservatives were in third place. In a lot of ridings, the Greens would win, and then the Liberals would have a couple thousand votes less, and then the Conservatives would have a couple thousand votes less than that. So it's funny that they kind of play that game of, well, we got to vote Liberal, because it just doesn't play out on a main stage. Strategic voting is just not a factor. If you want to hold government as a left-wing party or multiple left-wing parties, you're going to have a plurality of parties, or actually a majority of the seats as the left, if the momentum is there, and most often you do, right? So I think it's silly to suggest that you need to strategically vote for the Liberals. I don't think that's true at all. The Bloc Québécois vastly won in Quebec.
I was so surprised by that.
32 seats, outnumbering the NDP by 8 seats.
You were talking about Quebec separatism the other day, and I thought it was kind of obscure, but I see what you mean.
No, it's
like, it's on the rise.
It's real. Yeah, it's a real concern now. as well as Wexit, Western exit. I hate saying that. It just sounds so bad. That's bad. Western exit and Quebec exit. I don't really think either Quebec or the West are going to leave, but the separatist ideas are scary. It's scary for the cohesion we have as a nation. The one thing that I was really hoping for, although there was kind of a slim chance of this, is I was hoping that the Liberals and the NDP would just hold enough seats so that the Greens would push them over the majority target, so that they would have to work with the Greens, but unfortunately that didn't happen, although that was a very unlikely situation. But I was hoping that maybe the Greens would have more say in a government, and maybe they will. Maybe, it'll take the Greens to push them over on a few votes. That would be really nice. And we talked about this earlier. Alberta and Saskatchewan elected 0 Liberal candidates. 0, not one, out of, I think, 40 seats. No Liberals, 1 NDPer, and the rest were all Conservative. For a Liberal government, that should terrify Justin Trudeau. Mm-hmm. Let's just be totally honest. That, for Justin Trudeau, should be very scary. He needs to work hard to get the West back on board in some way. I don't know what he does. I don't think it should be through approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But there are ways that you can get Alberta back on track with the Liberal government and Saskatchewan back on board. But that needs to be done. He needs to, maybe he makes Ralph Goodale, who is taken out of his seat in Alberta. Maybe he elects him to the Senate and puts him in his cabinet. I don't know. It's going to take some serious work to get Alberta even recognizing that Justin Trudeau is prime minister, because some Albertans are like, no, I don't.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, they look at Justin Trudeau like, wow, this is not a leader,
So idea of separatism.
Yeah, another part of separatism. And that's one of my points, so I need to scroll past that. But the thing is, even in BC, which is a Western province, but it's not. It's a relatively liberal. Not liberal in the party sense, but it's a relatively left-leaning province, with Vancouver being a very environmentalist city. BC is generally a very environmentalist place, but the Conservatives came out on top in BC, as well as 2 Green seats. That's where Paul Manley and Elizabeth May both won their seats. They're the first 2 Green members of Parliament. But yeah, it was interesting to see the Conservatives in Canada's West really hammered out a lot of victories. And
why would you say that is?
I think it's mostly because the West feels they're ignored by Justin Trudeau and the rest of Canada. In Ontario, let's be honest, as somebody from Ontario,
you don't really think
the amount I think about Alberta is pretty small, right? And I think we need to kind of get rid of that attitude, because that's going to be bad. That's going to be bad for us if they continue to have this kind of separatist attitude rise. We could see some serious problems, and that's not what we need. And in this government, I'm going to shift topics a little bit. In this government, we saw the Liberal Party, while weakened a little bit by 20 seats, or 26 seats, they're still in power, despite young people, older people, Albertans, people from Saskatchewan, and even quite a few people in Ontario not happy with the Liberal government. And it's interesting, especially as young people. I think we have to look at this in a way where, currently you feel like you have to vote Liberal, you have to vote Conservative, because if you don't want the Conservatives to win, you need to vote Liberal, right? That's been the prevailing feeling in a long time. Same in the States. If you don't want the Republicans, you vote Democrat. You always vote Democrat.
That's kind of fair vote for the United States.
It is fair for the United States.
It's a fair point. Yes. You can't say that, that's not true.
Well, but that's partly because the system is built that way. But anyway.
We have a different system here.
Yeah.
You should vote for the party you believe in.
And that's the thing. As young people, we've kind of been screwed by the Liberal Party, to be quite frank. They are not as progressive as they play. But first, before I get into that, we're going to quickly talk about what Owen's opinion of what each party needs to do to succeed is going to be. So first of all, I think the NDP needs to keep Jagmeet Singh because he's obviously working for them. They were supposed to lose a ton more seats than they did. They were supposed to lose party status, which means they have less than 12, and he kept it up to 24. And that's not especially impressive for the NDP, but when you look at what they were supposed to lose, that's good news for the NDP, and I think they need to keep him around because he's a popular figure, and people really respect Jagmeet Singh. So I think for them, that's a key, and they need to focus on workers and union members. That's one of their key demographics that they don't often push enough, is focusing on workers and union members and focusing on workers' rights and really hammering that point home of we are the party of workers and we will support you. They did that to some degree in this election, but not nearly enough, and they need to do it more. As far as the Liberals are concerned, they need to work on the West, and Trudeau needs to keep himself squeaky clean. If he if he gets in any scandals or any serious issues like the India trip or SNC-Lavalin, it's going to be over for him. He's going to be gone if he has any more scandals. I mean, he cannot afford it because Ontario soon enough will turn on Justin Trudeau, and Quebec will continue to turn to the bloc unless Justin Trudeau steps it up and stops with these silly scandals, these helicopter rides with his corporate friends. He needs to really be careful, and he needs to impress the West and work for them as if as the major part of Canada they are. The Conservatives should get rid of Andrew Scheer. I mean, let's be totally honest. The Conservatives going into this campaign had the momentum to win. They could have won if they would have capitalized more, and if they didn't have Andrew Scheer as leader, and I'll tell you why. Andrew Scheer is I don't know if I want to call him a bigot, but he has previously likened gay marriage to, if regular marriage is the leg of a dog, calling gay marriage is like calling the tail a leg. Okay? He's obviously...
Sounds pretty bigoted to me.
It sounds bigoted to me. I know. People get offended when you call other people bigots, even if they are. So I just want to be as diplomatic as possible to Andrew Scheer. He's anti-gay. He is. There's no denying it. He said he's personally anti-gay, but he wouldn't reopen that issue.
That's disgusting.
Yeah, exactly. He's anti-abortion as well. He's pro-life.
There we go. Great.
There are numerous issues that Canadians just don't agree with.
Canadians are not. The
thing is, that needs to be gone. The Conservatives need a leader who is personally and professionally pro-gay marriage and pro-choice, at least to some degree, right? They cannot afford to have another social conservative as their leader. They probably should elect a female leader next time, because that's part of the reason why they lost Lisa Raitt, was they made no pitch to female voters. They made no effort in having any female conservative MPs around Andrew Scheer at all. It was just Andrew Scheer and a bunch of white men behind him. That was the whole conservative campaign.
Canadians don't feel represented. No,
you need to have a diverse group of people, and of course that includes women. You need to have female figures around you, and it can't your wife in like 3 Facebook posts on the Conservative Party Facebook page is not enough. You need to have female political leaders in the Conservative Party to attract female voters, right? You just won't be able to do it otherwise. Anyway, that's what they need to do. I think the Greens, they need to continue to do what they've been doing for some time, and that's holding other parties to account on their promises and pushing for environmentalism. But what they really should focus on are their 2 most accepting regions of the Greens, and those are BC and Atlantic Canada, because that's where their current seats are. They've got 2 in BC and they've got 1 in New Brunswick. They won in Fredericton. They need to push hard there. That's where they're going to pick up seats, and that's where they're going to start spreading. They need to push very hard in those regions, and they need to keep promising balanced budgets as well. Because that was one of the huge draws, at least for me, to the Greens over the NDP, was balancing the budget in 5 years. I think that's very important to have fiscal responsibility. Despite us being crazy leftists, you can't just spend forever. And the People's Party, oh boy, do I have some advice for the People's Party. I really think next election, the People's Party should just go away. Go away. You're not useful. Stop. That's it. I'm not giving you advice. I don't know. Just go away. Nobody, you got 2% of the vote.
Okay.
Go away.
Strong thoughts.
I don't like the People's Party.
I can tell.
Sorry. Maxime Bernier, he's terrible. Let's not focus on that.
Okay.
And now I have some final thoughts. I have some feelings for young people in particular, but people of all ages. I think seeing the Liberals win showed me that there's still a prevailing feeling that we have to settle for centrism and the systems that are already in place. And I think we, as the next generation, and as one of the most progressive and the most progressive generation in world history, need to stop accepting the establishment and stop accepting what not necessarily older generations, but the government and politicians tell us about the way things have to be. We do not have to accept massive debt coming out of post-secondary. We don't have to accept that housing prices are so ridiculously high compared to income. We don't have to accept corporate greed. These are things that we can fight against and we can win, but we have to all acknowledge together that we can fight these things and that we're able to change these systems and not just change what comes out of the system. We need to change the system itself. The government, they set laws, and politicians are not in charge of you. Keep that in mind. The government and their laws are in charge of you, but you are in charge of politicians as the population. We are in charge of them. We put them in office, and if we don't like what they're doing, if we think they're too centrist and not keeping their promises, we need to vote them out. Get rid of them, protest them, stop allowing them to govern. The Liberals, quite frankly, a lot of their base is a lot more progressive than they are. And we need to stop settling for what the Liberals are doing. They're a centrist party, and dare I say on some issues, a center-right party. We need
to stop. Like
the pipeline. We need to stop accepting governing. It's not good enough anymore. We must be progressive, and we must take action on environmentalism. And the Liberals are not. They're not doing nearly enough compared to what the UN mandates and science mandates we need to do. The only party that is the Green Party. And as much as I like the NDP, they aren't promising to do enough either. We need to push harder. We are the next generation, and we need to stop accepting corporatism. Don't strategically vote. Vote for what you believe in. And if nobody fits what you believe in, run for office. Sorry. Do it. Get politically active. There's no excuses anymore. We need to fight. We're old enough now. We need to start mobilizing. Yeah, those are my feelings. Sorry, I needed to get that out. I had an epiphany today, and I felt like, we as young people, the systems that are in place are simply not built to work for us, and we need to change them to work for us and force politicians to do what we decide. That's how I feel. Anyway, I don't know. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I second that.
Yeah.
Those are my thoughts. I second that. That sounds very like something I would say.
Yeah. Stop accepting average. Expect exceptional, and if you don't get it, vote differently and push harder.
And engage in activism.
Change. Very important.
Yeah, don't think you just have to sit by and, watch what's happening. You can go out and protest.
And if nobody's doing it politically, do it yourself. Yeah. So yeah, that's all we have for today. Subscribe, share the podcast with your friends because it does us a lot of good. Yeah. Thank you to Emma and Theo, who's in the studio today, but you can't see. And that's all. Thanks for watching our fifth episode. See you later.